So good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming to this session. So this is a session about developing cost effectiveness for decision making. What can be learned from value-based pricing? We've got three speakers. They're going to give different viewpoints on this topic, kind of UK based, but lots of lessons, international lessons, I think. So we have a slight change in the advertised ordering. So first of all, Adrian Towse from the Office of Health Economics is going to speak. Then we have Gavin Roberts from the Department of Health, and then James Raftery from University of Southampton will speak. So lots of time for discussion at the end, but we'll just have three presentations to start with, and all the questions, if you could leave them right until the very end, there'll be plenty of time for discussion. So straight away over to Adrian.
Thank you very much for the invite. What I'm going to do over the next half an hour is really touch on a number of issues, some of which will be picked up by the other speakers, and obviously we can pick them up in discussion. So I'm going to give a little bit of context and then focus on some of the issues that have come out. If I run out of time, I will cut some of the elements out. I'm not going to overrun. So really touching on some of the regulatory issues, particularly around pricing flexibility, then talk a little bit about the eliciting social preferences and what the work suggests about people's preferences over health and related issues in the UK, aggregating elements of value, so how is the decision maker supposed to add all of this up, touch on the threshold debate in the UK, if I have time to do that, and then on the Cancer Drugs Fund, which really has implications for pricing and issues around risk sharing and coverage with evidence development in the UK, and then some concluding points. So, starting off with the context, I found out to my horror when I did a search on my computer. I gave my first presentation on value-based pricing in 2007, and that was in response to the Office of Fair Trading, a competition authority in the UK that has now been merged with another body and has a different name. But their interest, they did a series of market reviews. So they were looking at the pharmaceutical market from the point of view of government as a purchaser, and they made a series of recommendations, some of which were around pricing flexibility and were picked up in the 2009 pricing agreement between the government and the industry. But the key one around value-based pricing for individual drugs was then subsequently picked up by the coalition government that came into office 5 years ago. And the elements here I've listed down were to introduce this broader definition of value to go beyond the health effect on the individual and the cost to the healthcare system, but to add in other elements, including social weights. But also then to essentially quantify that in a way that you could pull a handle, as it were, and come up with a calculation for what the price of a new drug should be based on those elements of value, and then in effect impose or negotiate around that price with the company. And that would replace the 5-year procurement agreements, the pharmaceutical price regulation agreements, because each new product would have a value-based price as it came in, and that would also avoid NICE saying no, which leads to a lot of tabloid newspaper headlines critical of NICE and by implication of the government. And it would also enable the Cancer Drugs Fund, which was this mechanism I'll touch on very briefly at the end, whereby cancer drugs that are rejected by NICE can still be funded from another pot of money. And the idea was that was temporary, and when value-based pricing was introduced, that additional fund could be got rid of. So a lot was weighted on the ability to come up with this broader social value of a drug, and then the ability to institutionalize that in a way that meant that the existing arrangements of NICE appraisal and the 5-year procurement deal between the industry and the government would disappear. So, picking up then each of these elements, starting with regulating pharmaceuticals. So, I mean, I've argued, and this is a paper here, and I've got the references at the back. They need a little bit of tidying up, but I'll make sure they're all clean by the time it's posted on your website. That actually, rather than controlling individual prices, what health systems should be doing is setting their willingness to pay for health gain. And then what should happen now with the cost effectiveness threshold, which should reflect the preferences of the taxpayers or the enrollees that the health system is buying care for. And that's the best way of sending the right signals for innovation to the pharmaceutical industry. And that's better than set it, and obviously then you then put the context of the price that the company is asking in the context of whether it provides value for money at that threshold, and if it doesn't, then you don't list it, or if it does in particular subgroups of patients or for particular indications, you only list it for those patient groups or those indications, which is pretty much how NICE tries to operate at the moment. I think the price setting the individual price of the drug rather than the threshold and willingness to pay increases the degree of commercial uncertainty and can lead to opportunistic behavior on part of both of the payer and of the company. But that's obviously something I'm very happy to debate. Moving on then to the other element that I wanted to raise in this part of the presentation, which is really around pricing flexibility and collecting more evidence and changing price. So this whole issue of what we know about a drug and what we know about its cost effectiveness is likely to change over time as we get more evidence. And this is a simple chart which shows its analysis that one of my colleagues has done based on decisions on the NICE website, and it shows the impact of what are called patient access schemes that were introduced in the 2009 pharmaceutical 5-year pharmaceutical price regulation scheme in response to the Office of Fair Trading report on value-based pricing. So one of the elements was for pricing flexibility, and that was introduced quite quickly as a framework. Some of these schemes are risk-sharing schemes, but most of them are straight confidential discounts. And what you can see here, and attempt to analyze that without the patient access scheme, then NICE no rates would have been around 50%, but with the pricing flexibility built in from 2009, then effectively they go down to about a quarter. So you can see that element of flexibility has been quite key in enabling, giving pharmaceutical companies some flexibility that has led to more approvals by NICE. The other couple of reports that I think highlight the importance of flexibility here. This one on the left is a report from the Academy of Medical Sciences on personalized medicine, pharmacogenetics, stratified medicine, precision medicine, lots of different names. But what we're talking about is greater targeting of treatments. And the issue the Academy were identifying was that knowledge about targeting evolves over time, and therefore there needs to be pricing flexibility built in. And there's a chapter in that section that looks at how the UK in particular, but it's very generalizable, can introduce more pricing flexibility in the context of stratified medicine. And this is a report, ISPOR task force, that I was a co-chair of with Lou Garrison from the University of Washington, that sets out the principles for performance-based risk-sharing arrangements. And the one element that I think is also important here is increasingly is multi-indication pricing, particularly for new oncology drugs, where we know not only for subgroups of patients with an existing indication, but typically there'll be a number of indications for drugs which will have very different value. And one of the challenges for health systems is the ability to organize, to pay different prices for different uses. Again, the 2009 PPRS introduced, in principle, the ability to have that flexibility, so companies can bring in another indication at a different price to the existing indication, but they have to be able to manage that within the health system. And so far, there have been no examples of that happening. So, in a sense, having a framework that is permissive, but also working out how to do that in practice, is one of the great challenges, certainly for the UK health system, and I suspect for many health systems. But it is going to be very important if we're going to get the best value from the use of drugs. And the danger of single prices is that we end up not using drugs in a lot of areas for a lot of subgroups of patients where, with flexibility, it would be possible for the health system to use them. So, moving on to the second part, which I think is the core of the later phase of value-based pricing, the most recent phase of the coalition government, the Conservative Lib Dem government trying to introduce and move beyond setting prices or NICE approving drugs at prices that just reflect health gain for the patient and the cost to the health system. So trying to go beyond that. So the starting point was to understand what else do people value. So what else should we want the decision maker, in this case NICE, to be taking into account. And this is a paper that I did with a colleague, Paul Barnsley, and we basically set out here then, in a sense, what is the challenge? So can we move beyond health gain and reducing system cost? And what we found in a survey of payers around the world is there are a lot of variations, but no systematic hitherto attempts to do this. So the UK government's attempt to do this was the first, I think, systematic attempt to do this. And the question is, what are we doing? Are we providing information for an extra welfarist decision maker, or are we actually, from a welfare perspective, trying to understand what the consumers want, so we can reflect that in what is provided? Or, of course, are we trying to do a combination? So we're using essentially a welfarist approach to elicit preferences in order to inform the decision maker. I think that's probably what we're doing, or what we were trying to do, but I'm open to discussion on that. So there were two key exercises undertaken. One was to come up with a way of providing a broader, or calculating a broader societal impact, which Gavin led that work on, is going to talk about in a moment. The second part was a piece of work that was undertaken by EPRU, which is a collaboration between the University of Sheffield and the University of York. I'm going to talk very quickly about the conclusions of that work. And here I've identified one particular issue, end-of-life findings. Here the EPRU, which I'll come on to in a moment. My colleague, Kunal Shah, along with Alan Whaley, found a different result, and there's a third paper here which found yet another result. So even on the end-of-life issues, what we find is when you ask the public, depending on how you ask, you get different results, which actually sometimes are quite difficult to reconcile. But moving on then to a couple of slides on what the EPRU work commissioned by the Department of Health found in terms of UK social preferences over key elements of weighting of that health gain for the individual patient. So this was a discrete choice experiment with around 3,500 online respondents. And they were asking whether groups, in each occasion, do we treat group A or group B? There were 4 attributes that were varying: life expectancy without treatment, to get at severity, quality of life gain without treatment, survival gain from treatment, and quality of life gain from treatment. And they were exploring 3 elements: therapeutic improvement, where the issue was, is there a benefit, an additional benefit in getting a big gain? So should we pay more for blockbusters with significant health gain over and above what the prices that the quality gain would justify? So should there be an additional multiplier benefit for first-in-class blockbusters? Secondly, the disease severity, the burden of illness. So do we value a quality more if it's delivering health gain to someone who is more severely ill? And then this end-of-life criteria. So NICE is currently operating a system whereby there's a higher threshold, a higher willingness to pay for drugs, when we're treating conditions where the patient has is expected to have less than 6 months to live. So that's and the implication is that we value delivering QALYs in that context more than in other contexts. What we found, or what the EPRU survey found, that respondents preferred to treat patients with larger QALY gains, but at a diminishing rate. So there's no support for therapeutic improvement. So at its bluntest, what it found was delivering very substantial QALY gains to individuals, curing a disease or whatever, that's very important, but actually the public would rather that QALY gain was spread across the population as in the form of smaller gains. So respondents did prefer to treat patients with a shorter life expectancy, so there was a preference in this study for end of life, although as I indicated in the earlier slide, there's a couple of other studies that found different effects. So the second slide on the EPRU findings, so there was some support for burden of illness, and what they did was, what the EPRU group did was reanalyze, excluding around 1,000, around 15. If you remember, the 3,600 roughly completed the online study. It took out about 1,400 of them and had a remaining sample of 2,200, which did produce positive, significant, robust severity of illness or burden of illness coefficients. And these are the marginal rates of substitution. 1 unit of severity was equivalent to 0.04 of QALY gains, i.e. the willingness to trade additional QALYs for targeting QALYs at people with more severe diseases, and the end of life was equivalent to 3.31. So the importance of the quantification was that, so in effect, this can be turned into a formula. So we can actually look at what is the severity of disease in the drug that's being proposed, how does that compare with the average severity in the NHS, so what is the multiplier that's appropriate to apply for the QALY gain that's provided by the treatment. So they were arguing, although there was support for end of life in general, because it overlaps with disease severity, then you shouldn't do both. So you either have a severity adjustment or you have an end of life. If you operate both, you're in a great danger of double counting, so you should make a choice. But clearly the results showed that a QALY is not a QALY, that society values QALYs in different circumstances to different groups or in different settings quite differently. So that was the results of the EPRU work, and so that enabled, was then moved on to dropping the therapeutic improvement, so no additional premium for blockbusters, and the Sheffield-led group were able to come up with a calculus that enabled you to transform those marginal rates of substitution into a framework that enabled you to say, well, if this is the disease severity, then this is the multiplier that NICE should be applying to the QALY gain. Of course, in some circumstances, if the average disease severity in a particular therapy area is less than the average disease severity being treated by the NHS, then the multiplier is less than 1. So again, to be very clear, that QALYs in less than average disease severity conditions would have their QALYs down-rated rather than up-rated. So it depends on the disease severity. Where NICE got to was putting out a proposal which used 2 different concepts, and I've indicated them here: absolute and proportional QALY shortfall. So absolute QALY shortfall, here again we've got the quality of life and the time to give us QALYs. The absolute QALY shortfall being effectively this area ABC in relation to what we get with current treatment. So how many absolute QALYs is the individual losing rather than being in full health, continuing with the current treatment or standard of care, whatever it is. And the proportional QALY shortfall is where this area is weighted in relation to the total potential QALY gain. So you can see that we're still looking at the same absolute QALY loss, but in the case of the proportional QALY shortfall, then we're weighting that according to what to the absolute full health qualities that the individual will gain. So just to highlight critically the difference here being someone, an elderly person or someone being towards the end of their lives, then clearly proportional shortfall gives them a much greater weighting in the severity calculation than would absolute quality shortfall. So, so a key issue is how one manages this, and one can think of the Alan Williams fair innings as being a proportional quality shortfall from birth, which is in a sense a form of hybrid of this. I'm going to skip that slide and just try and put the EPRU findings and the absolute and proportional shortfall calculations I've just shown you in context of where we got to during 2014. So, as I mentioned, the EPRU study showed that additional weighting for blockbusters didn't make sense, so that was dropped. There was an operational model of the severity weightings and of the societal value that Gavin's going to present in a moment. So that was handed over to NICE in 2012, and they were asked, in a sense, to try and make it work. So how could NICE implement severity-based weightings using the EPRU analysis and societal value weightings and calculations in accordance with the DH analysis? I'll pass on this one. And NICE consulted in 2013 on two different aspects. So rather than taking through the EPRU severity weights and the DH societal calculation, what they did was propose that severity weightings should use not the EPRU calculation but a proportional shortfall calculation, and the societal impact should be based on an absolute quality shortfall. So they were proposing two proxies for the detailed calculus that they were given in 2012. So they said, well, that's all too complicated. Let's just use proportional shortfall for severity and absolute shortfall as a proxy for societal effect. And that would replace the end-of-life effect. So the end-of-life uplift would disappear. And there were consultations, I think broadly, and this is one of the challenges for, I think, implementing change. So there's an interesting intellectual exercise about eliciting preferences, turning them into a calculus and something that's usable by a decision-making body. But then the implications of that and getting that accepted by politicians and others is very difficult. And this was NICE's attempt to compromise, as it were. I think the simplest way of putting it is the compromise didn't satisfy anybody. So people who didn't like it, didn't like the calculus, didn't like NICE's variation, and the people who thought the calculus was the right way to go didn't like NICE's compromise. So where we got to in October 13, NICE announcing there was no mandate for change. End of life would stay. So in effect, the 20 to 30,000. This is the 20 to 30,000 threshold would continue. And the end-of-life uplift would continue. So I think where we've got to, which is very important, is that we've gone through a very interesting analytical approach, but so far we haven't managed to translate that into a form that the key decision-making body or recommending body has been willing to use. It proposed a variation on that, which wasn't acceptable to most of the stakeholders, and so in a sense we've done a lot of work. We understand a lot more. But we don't yet have anything that's implementable. So I'm conscious of time, so what I think I'll do is I'll just touch briefly on this one, which in a sense is this question of the proposal for value-based pricing was to try and make this as mechanistic as possible. So we'd have the calculation for additional societal value, we'd have a threshold, and we'd have a severity calculation. But what we know in practice is that, or what we have at the moment, is very much a deliberative process. And I think the best way of putting it, this is, I think, a very good slide by Ron Guri, who runs PATH Institute at McMaster University, is what we're seeing, in effect, is, and part of the whole value-based pricing, is that these other factors, instead of being an afterthought that's over here, are coming very much into the central element of how do we think about value. It's not just about safety and efficacy, which the regulator worries about, or effectiveness, the HTA body is primarily focusing on. All of these things are now integral to the assessment of value, and then of course that has to be weighted against costs, opportunity cost, and budget impact. So we are in, I think that the whole debate in the UK, I think, reflects a much broader trend to a recognition that these other factors are actually central, and the more we can bring them in at the start and think about how we're going to quantify and assess them, then the more constructive the decision-making process is going to be. I think I'll skip that. So final one here then. So we have, in effect, multiple criteria. So we're moving beyond a simple analysis of health gain for the patient, cost to the healthcare system. So we're bringing in all of these other elements. A pure deliberative process, which arguably NICE uses at the moment, then the big challenge there is the committee decides, smoke goes up, but how did they make that decision? And we know at the end in the decision they list the factors they've taken into account. What we don't know is which ones actually had an impact on the decision and what was the rationale. And so in that sense it's a black box. But a pure algorithmic approach, if we just pull the handle and we've got the calculation, we feed in the numbers, then we don't actually need a committee. So the question for me is, there must be something workable inside, in between, that's theoretically robust and that is a tool for supporting decision makers, so that they are clearer why they've reached a decision, what mattered to them, and that of course makes it easier for them to explain to the public and other stakeholders as to why they didn't approve a particular technology, or approved it for some patients but not others. Yeah, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put up one slide for this and not go into it, but many of you will be aware we've had quite a vigorous debate in the UK about the cost effectiveness threshold. This is the latest final version of the Claxton et al. Paper, which came up with the estimate of just under 13,000. This is a critique that I and my colleagues did at the Office of Health Economics. It's on our website, and this is a commentary that James did in pharmacoeconomics, where he picked out the key assumptions and set out his views. So I won't, in the interest of time, go through all of this, but I know there's work going on in Spain in this as well, but it's a very, very lively and core area. As we're varying, what are we adding on the top? This central issue of what is the core opportunity cost we're giving up if we invest more resources into drugs as compared to other things is absolutely key. The only thing I would add here is that what we need to bear in mind is, as we're trying to understand what on earth goes on in the rest of the NHS, and this is work some of my colleagues did in Scotland, and here you can see the cost per QALY of those that were accepted and the cost per QALY of those that were rejected by Scottish health authorities, and what you can see, of course, is no particular relation. So what we have is lots of decision makers in the health system where cost per QALY appear to be irrelevant to the decisions that are made. So we have to think about not just understanding that in order to work out what the cost effectiveness threshold should be for drugs, but we also need to be thinking, well, shouldn't we be trying to change this? Shouldn't we be trying to improve the quality of decision making in the rest of the health system? So what I'm going to do, I think, is just show one point on the Cancer Drugs Fund. So that the simple point about the Cancer Drugs Fund is it was set up with a budget to approve drugs that NICE said no to. So not unsurprisingly, this started to change the behavior of companies, because they now got their drug paid for. They didn't have to lower their price for NICE. So not unsurprisingly, the budget had to keep going up. It was eventually capped, so NHS England had to introduce their own rationing criteria to try and ration this extra pot. Martin Buxton, with myself, James, and others, then proposed that actually this fund would be better off transferred into some kind of coverage with evidence development type fund for cancer drugs that appeared to have promise, a reasonable chance, if the uncertainty was addressed, of coming in within NICE's existing threshold. So we were arguing for coming back to this question of pricing flexibility. So, final slide. Where do I think we've got to from the last 8 years, 2007? So I personally think value-based assessment is a better way forward than value-based pricing. Either systems should concentrate on what is its willingness to pay for health gain. I think value-based assessment is alive, just. We need a broader definition of value, I think. There's a lot of important work has been done in the UK that I think is relevant, and I think we should go back to it. I think pricing flexibility and more outcomes-based coverage with evidence development type schemes are very important, and we may see in some of the attempts to reform the Cancer Drugs Fund, we may see more of that happening in the UK. I think we do need to support deliberative processes by decision makers with more structure, whether we call it MCDA or whatever. I think that's very important. And we do, as I said, need to think about that rather than observing what's happening in the other 90% of the health system and trying to understand what on earth it means for pharmaceuticals, we actually need to be thinking more about how to improve decision making in that other 90% of the health system. Thank you.
So my name's Gavin Roberts. Thank you very much for coming to this session and for inviting me to come here and give a presentation. I work for the Department of Health in England, and what I'm going to present is some methodology that we developed at the Department of Health during the period that Adrian just reviewed. It's not going to be my job to just to be a spokesman for the Department of Health in any way. As Adrian says, value-based pricing, as it was conceived, is not being used by NICE, and I think he gave as much of a summary of any plans to develop it further for use by NICE that I wouldn't want to improve on or expand on. So I'm going to be talking about this methodology, which anyone can use if they want, but what I'm not going to be doing is giving any view as to whether it should be used or whether it will be used by people like NICE. It is something we use internally in the Department of Health, but beyond that, it's not really my place to express views. If I do start expressing views, they're my views as a professional economist, not a DH spokesman. So hopefully I've emphasised that enough times now, and I can get on with the presentation. So I'm going to go through a methodology that allows us to estimate. It's one half of what Adrian described when he talked about the expansion of consideration of value. The first half being these weightings on QALYs to reflect society's preferences for giving QALYs in one circumstance rather than another. The other half is this measurement of other elements of value beyond the health gains to patients, the impacts on wider society. And so to give an overview of the talk, first I'm going to just review that principle that there are these wider impacts from changes in patient health. And secondly, this is probably the most important part of what I'm going to describe. The rest is in some sense details that follow from this, which is a definition of the wider impact on society that is consequent on the change in a patient's health. And we define it and go on to measure it as the difference between an individual's production of resources and their consumption of resources. The principle being that the difference between those two is resources that are available for others in society to consume, or if the difference is negative, those are resources that the individual consumes which have to be taken from someone else in society. So having hopefully established that definition, I'm then going to talk about how we can actually implement it by estimating this concept of net production as a function of patient health. And I'm going to describe a calculation mechanism which does this. So for 4 inputs which are readily available, we can estimate the the rate at which an individual generates net production resources. And that's really the core calculation that we developed. And then I'm going to go on to give some results for what for the rates of net production that we see for different health states and different circumstances. And then, so of course, we're not just interested in the rate of an individual net production. We're interested in the effect on this of a treatment. I'm going to go through some results of the impact on net production of different treatments in using various degrees of input data. Okay, so changes in patient health have wider economic consequences. So we're quite used in health economics, certainly in the Department of Health, to thinking about treatments we give to patients and measuring firstly their costs to the system, to the NHS in the UK, and then secondly the value of their benefits to the patient, which we estimate using QALYs. But that is clearly not the full extent of the impact of any treatment. If a patient is treated, they might work more. That means they might pay more tax. They might contribute to their family finances. They might look after others more, need less looking after by family members themselves, and so forth. And I'm going to go through a categorization of these that's a bit more formal later. But the basic principle is that when we provide a health treatment, we don't just provide health to the patient. There are consequences for others. And it's these consequences for other people that we are endeavouring to estimate here. So how are we going to do that? And this is where the definition becomes critical in then allowing us to start to think about how to actually measure that impact on others. So, well, really just to recap this, what we're talking about is a patient and their effect on other people. And the way we think about this is the following. We can think of a patient as generating economic resources, termed as their production or their gross production, which you can conceive of as being contributed to this pool that, of society's resources, but they also consume resources, which we can conceive of as being taken from this pool. So, for example, if we and the difference between those two quantities, we term their net production net of consumption, and you can see that if we were able to measure the gross production by a patient and their gross consumption, and there's some illustrative numbers there, then we would say that if they're producing £1,500 per month and consuming 1,000, the residual of £500 per month would be available for others to consume in society. It would be a net contribution to others in society. And now, importantly, there are two ways of actually going about measuring this. So I'm talking about this impact on others. Well, one way of measuring that would be to actually go and trace the consequences, trace the fate of this residual amount of production in society. So we might look at the patient's impact on their family or their friends or other members of society. For instance, their family might, as a result of the patient's health and production and consumption, have different costs for spending on nursing homes. A patient might need informal care. The patient might provide less domestic work or more domestic work. Similarly, thinking of other members of society, a patient might, in particular, pay more or less tax, need more or less welfare benefits. We actually started trying to look at this problem from this perspective. In principle, you would get the same result. So this is a crucial part of our approach, is that you ought to get the same result whichever approach you took, whether you looked at the patient themselves or whether you looked at the people who benefited from their residual net production. But it turns out to be essentially impossible to do it this way. So happily, we can get the same result just by focusing on the patient and looking at their amount of production, their amount of consumption, and the residual, which we know will end up being an effect on someone else, but we don't have to know who, we don't have to trace that all through. So that's what I'm going to do for the rest of this talk, is explain how we can take the perspective of a patient and their production and consumption in order to estimate this residual of net production. And the way we do that is for any given patient, we have a methodology which we can use 4 input variables. So if we know a patient's age, and these are just going to be illustrative numbers, and their gender, their ICD code, so the type of condition they have at a high level, and their health-related quality of life, we can estimate their gross production consumption. And it turns out to be convenient to do this by categorizing production and consumption. And on the production side, we have the patient's paid labor. This is what most people think of straight away when they think of an individual's contribution. But of course, so we might, for instance, and this is illustrative, we might observe that a patient generates £600 worth of paid labour per month. But of course, there's more to an individual's contribution than what they get paid for. Much of what we do is valuable to society, but does not associate with a financial transaction. We need to measure the patient's unpaid labour as well, which we can do, as I'm going to go on to show. So in this illustrative case, we would say that the individual was generating £1,500 worth of net production. On the consumption side, we use the following categories in no particular order. The informal care they receive from their family members, which we are able to value. Let's say that was on average £80 for patients with these inputs. Their formal social care, and I'm not going to go into all the others in detail, but so their paid consumption, so this is general housing, clothing, things like these. We want to capture all of the resources individuals consume, and we think we do through this categorization. So we do that, add up these elements of consumption to get a gross consumption figure, and subtract one from the other to get the net production, so the amount of resources that they are net contributing to someone else. So this is the principle, and we have methodologies for each of these elements which allow us to do this. So what I'm going to do now, actually I'm going to skip through this bit because I don't have time. So what we would like to do, of course, is, so I'm going to go back one, so with this methodology we can estimate net production and all these sub-elements for any patient given these variables. But of course what we want to be able to do is to look at the impact of treatments, and in principle this is straightforward. So we would, for instance, we might have a treatment which improves the quality of life of a patient, in this example by 20%. Well, that would simply give us a different set of inputs, and we would and the calculation yields the new outputs for those inputs. You might think that by raising someone's quality of life, they would provide more paid labour, more unpaid labour, therefore more gross production. And similarly, they might need less informal and formal care, and so have less consumption overall. So in this illustrative example, the patient's net production would have increased as a result of improving their quality of life. And we would then say that raising the patient's quality of life would have generated £200 per month in additional net production. So I'm going to very briefly touch on one of the sub-elements to show, to give an idea of the kinds of underlying models that we use for each of these sub-elements. I'm going to pick paid labour. So so to say, our methodology yields a figure for the estimated rate of contribution of paid labour given these inputs. Very briefly, the way we do this is we base this on a study called Understanding Society. This is actually work that Sheffield University did for us in support of this. That contains a question which asks a large sample of people, did you do paid work last week? It also contains a health instrument as well as age and gender. And what Shah at Sheffield did for us is estimate a model. I'm not going to go into the detail of this, but essentially allowing us to estimate the probability that a patient works as a function of their age and quality of life. And we can combine that with wages data to give what we want, which is the estimate of the value of paid labour per month as a function of age, gender and quality of life. So that's a very brief explanation of the model underlying our paid labour estimate. Similar models underlie the other elements, and I'm not going to go into those right now, but all of this information is available in the public domain. So now I'm going to skip on to the results. First, I'm going to talk about the net production rates given a health state. So a patient in a given health state will have certain quantities of these elements. I'm going to go quite quickly through this, I think. So the first, paid production. So this shows how the estimate of a patient's paid production through paid labour varies with age along the x-axis, and the different traces are for different levels of quality of life. And as you would expect, so green, fully green is fully healthy. The healthier you are, the more paid labour you provide, and there is an age effect that you might expect. Next, unpaid production. All of this gets really quite interesting. I don't have time to go into it in detail. But again, as you'd expect, the healthier you are, the more unpaid production you provide. But interestingly, we find that we observe that as you get older, people tend to keep providing this, which is something that is not always obvious. And also, if you would have noticed the y-axis scale, the value of unpaid production is comparable to the value of paid production. So this is still in unpaid production. Another interesting thing is that, well, this might have been your preconception, but women provide greater value of unpaid production than men, as you may or may not have expected. So I'm going to go quite quickly through the rest of these elements. This is formal care consumption, so formal social care. And this reminds me to say that not all of the models under this are very sophisticated. Our estimate of the need for formal social care is very crude indeed, and we hope to improve it substantially. But as you can see, the sicker patients are the more they need, and they only really use formal social care at the end of life. I'm not going to comment on the rest. I don't really have time. But when we put all these together, so this is now the total net production of an individual as a function of their age and quality of life. You can see, as you might expect, the healthier you are, the more you provide. But also there are an awful lot, there's a very large number of combinations of age and quality of life state where patients are net consumers. And what I should emphasise again is these are the rates for a given health state. This does not yet refer to treatment impacts, which I'm going to talk about now. So that allows you to calculate the amount of net production given a patient's characteristics. What we want to do is look at how much that changes when people receive health treatments. Now, in principle, this is extremely straightforward. It's entirely analogous to the use of quality of life to calculate QALYs by multiplying over time. So when we calculate QALYs, if we have quality of life on the y-axis, we might have this profile for a patient in an untreated state, and this might be the profile in a treated state. We simply add up the areas under the curves, and we could say that the treatment would generate, in this case, 1.5 QALYs, which is the green area. Now, because we can effectively transform quality of life directly to a net production number, exactly the same calculation can be done for net production. So we might observe that a patient, or estimate that a patient has net production rate of £1,000, this is per year now, in their untreated health state, and this lasts for 1 year, but that when treated their production rate is £2,000 and it lasts for 2 years. In this case, we would say the net production impact of that treatment would be, again, with the area under the curve, £3,000. So in principle, this is very straightforward because it follows directly from quality of life and can be mapped directly from quality of life. In practice, there is a problem because all these effects are very non-linear with respect to age in particular. So this is just showing a figure I showed before, that you cannot use the average of patient ages if you have a population of patients. And in principle, that's okay. You just need to calculate it across all the ages in your population. In practice, that information might not be available. So what we've done is, and what I'm going to go on to talk about, is developed reference estimates which represent population age distributions for different conditions, and which we can use to then measure net production impacts, even if we don't have the actual ages for the particular affected population. And so, an overview of how we do this. We have this data set which we got from the University of York, which covers for nearly 1,300 ICDs, and within each ICD, 16 age and gender bins. Firstly, we have the distribution of the population for that ICD across those age and gender bins. And we also have enough data in each bin to calculate all of these elements of net production that I described. So, for example, we can pick an ICD, such as rheumatoid arthritis, and knowing nothing more than that, we can come up with an estimate of the net production of a typical treatment for that condition. And the results you get depend entirely on whether your actual population is represented by this reference estimate. But, so for instance, and now this is a real number, we estimate using this data set that treatments for rheumatoid arthritis generate £38,000 worth of net production impact per QALY of health gain provided. Another way of stating this is to talk about the amount of net production per pound of health spending, which requires an assumption I won't go into just now. So, so that's the overview of how we can use this data set, and we can use it in a lot more detail than that as well. I don't know if you can see this, but so this is now still for rheumatoid arthritis. So this is the total net production impact per QALY of gain that I've already presented. But of course we have all of the sub-elements that I described. So for example, we would say that providing a QALY in rheumatoid arthritis provides £11,000 worth of increased paid production. It reduces the residential care need or use by £1,800. We can also split that up in terms of the impact through quality and length of life. I won't go into that, nor will I go into, well, yeah, nor will I go into this. And we can go even further with another piece of data. We can do things like characterize the impact on, the average impact on the paid hours worked per week, for example. So here grey is full health, red is untreated, green is treated, and this is for the different age groups. The richness of analysis you can do with this is quite amazing. It all completely depends on whether these inputs are correct, of course. And similarly, you can do something with modelling informal care needs. And all this is with no extra data. So that was for rheumatoid arthritis. We can do that for every condition across these ICDs. And so what I'm showing here is a few selected ICDs with the results in terms of the value of net production per QALY gained, and also in the final column the value of net production per pound of NHS spending. And so a couple of things to point out about this. First is there is a large variation. The things at the top generate about as much additional net production as the things at the bottom cost. So I haven't explained this very well. So you wouldn't get so dementia, which comes at the top here. This implies that if you provide a QALY in dementia, you generate £40,000 worth of additional net production. But as you go down the list, the numbers actually turn negative, and there are a large number of treatments, if they are represented effectively by our data set, which generate additional net consumption. Now these tend to be treatments that, rather than improve quality of life, extend length of life. Now there's a fundamental rationale for why this might be the case, which is that if you extend somebody's life, you might lead to them being generating more production. You'll certainly lead to them having greater consumption, and particularly if you're extending life in low quality of life, production impact is likely to be low or nothing, and the amount of consumption per QALY of gain is likely to be quite high. So you get a lot of conditions which have negative net production or net consumption. Thanks. The other thing to say, and I'm going to talk about it in a bit more detail, is that, of course, as Adrian alluded to, well, when we fund something in the NHS, we don't just get the benefits from that treatment in terms of QALYs and net production, but we must take money from somewhere else in the NHS, displacing other activity. That displaces QALYs. It also displaces the net production benefits associated with those QALYs. And as I'm going to go on to show, we can estimate those too. And so, as again Adrian alluded to, the willingness to pay for a treatment would only increase when you add these things in if the amount of additional value is greater than the additional value you get elsewhere. So that defines this line here. So for instance, using these estimates, for every QALY gained in obesity, you generate £8,000 of net production, but that's less than the net production that you displace elsewhere. So even though it's a positive number, the net impact of funding such a treatment would be negative in terms of the net production effect. So finally, I'm going to just give a bit more explanation of how we get to that number, and we can do that because we have this description again from the York work data that I alluded to of NHS activity at the margin, which is fantastically powerful. So you can't read these, I'm sure, but this represents our list of these 1,300 conditions. Now, one of the other things we know for each of these conditions is we have an estimate of how a marginal NHS pound, so an additional pound given to the NHS or subtracted, of how that is distributed across each of these ICDs. And within each ICD, we have an estimate for how it is distributed across each of the 16 age gender groups within it. So we have an estimate overall of how this pound is distributed across 21,000 ICD age gender bins at the margin in the NHS. Now, of course, for each of these bins, we can calculate the net production impact and all the sub-elements as well. And we can use all that information to calculate a weighted average estimate for the net production impact of a marginal pound in the NHS budget. And these are the results you get. So for every additional pound spent in the NHS, we estimate you generate 93 pence worth of additional net production, the total economic impact. And of course, this can all be subdivided. So we'd say that it results in £1.50 worth of additional production, of which 63p, and this is something that the Department of Health is interested in emphasising within government, the 63p paid labour impact is a direct increase in GDP for people who care about such things. So if you give the NHS another pound, you would expect directly to increase GDP by 63p. And of course, people may or may not be interested in all the various sub-elements of consumption and production. Our final thing to say about this is that, so this 93p is of course additional to the value of the health itself, which you could argue makes the NHS really good value for money at the margin. So very briefly to touch on the next steps for this work. The first is to use it with real interventions and conditions, and that's happening in various places in Department of Health and elsewhere. But most importantly is that I'm sort of now satisfied that this overall framework is broadly correct, and that the answers it gives are better than not doing it, if one cares about these things. But the underlying models some of them are very crude indeed, and we are really, it's a priority for us if we can have the resource to improve these, in particular the paid production estimates, which we expect to be able to improve. I won't go into more detail on what we might do here. And the estimates of formal social care, which is a very important determinant of net production, and our estimates are very crude indeed for that at the moment. Okay, there's a lot more I could say about that, but now's probably not the time. So, and that's it. Thank you very much.
It's on the desktop, yeah. I hope all that made sense to you. Very complex, very technical, a great opportunity for doing lots of research in England, and I want to offer a very different perspective. A personal view, but also, in brackets, why it all went wrong. And that has come through from what several of the people have said. A policy was announced, many conferences were held, much work was commissioned, many people got very angry, got cross, got worried that something terrible was going to happen, and in the end, nothing happened. Now to come down, how do I do this? So it's on here? Yeah. Sorry, I'm being completely technophobic here. Yeah, just forward. Yeah, okay. A timeline is helpful. I won't spend too much on this, but the timeline is important. In 2007, we started with a report that introduced the notion of value. 2008, a change in the prescription pricing system which is how drugs are priced, and introduced a commitment that was advocated by the Association of British Pharmaceutical Industry to reviewing NICE. And the background is that industry does not like NICE. That's pretty fundamental to the story. In 2009, NICE was told to raise its cost per quality threshold for end-of-life drugs because it was in the newspapers. It was unpopular. A new government came in and promised to introduce value-based pricing, set up an extraordinary cancer drugs fund. Extraordinary because here was the Department of Health setting up a fund to fund drugs that NICE said no to. The same department sets up NICE, NICE says no, and now we set up another fund to fund the ones that NICE says no to. Insane. And that fund was described as a bridge to value-based pricing, which was magic thinking. It would abolish rationing and abolish bad news stories at a stroke. Value-based pricing was magic realism. The government had to do a consultation, and the requirement to do consultations is interesting, and it's to do with recent changes in the British government to try and ensure that the civil service provides evidence-based advice to ministers. And what was extraordinary was there was a consultation which was accompanied by documents from the civil servants in the Department of Health, which showed that there was no empirical basis for proceeding down the line that the minister wanted to go. Really quite extraordinary and wonderful, surreal, and I'll show you where to find the details of all of this in a moment. So the government had a consultation, and initially it looked like it was going to abolish NICE, and it realized it was much too complicated and began to retreat. And then later it said, okay, this is so complex, we'll hand it all over to NICE. NICE then decided they would do another consultation. So we've had one consultation that got nowhere, now we'll have another consultation. And NICE consulted on something that hardly anybody understood, the quality shortfall approach, completely different from all the work that had been done up above that Gavin has talked about, and said, we'll do nothing. What an extraordinary way around. Why should you care about what I'm saying? Well, I've done a blog in the British Medical Journal on this since it started, and they're there, and you can find them. Just go into the BMJ website and you get blogs someplace down here. So what I want to talk about is why did this happen? How to make sense of it, because it's very easy to mock, and it's quite fun, but it's not very helpful. So I'm going to try and be helpful rather than just be in mocking mode. So the factors I think that were important was a new government, an ambitious minister, lots of interest groups, an ambiguous title, specialist language, you've just heard some of it, self-contradictory claims, unanticipated consequences, a big clash about market and NHS, National Health Service, and, well, in a sense, what could possibly go wrong? Everything was going to go wrong given this lineup. But in trying to be helpful, I'll talk a bit about NICE in a societal perspective and some blunders and some lessons. The new coalition government, this was an idea from a new government that was introduced, or was elected in 2010, and it promised that it would reform NICE. Quite extraordinary. It actually quoted, we'll reform NICE and we'll move to value-based pricing. And as I've said, set up the Cancer Drugs Fund in a rather bizarre way to fund drugs that NICE had said no to. And also, this built on the end-of-life criteria, which NICE had been required to introduce by the previous government because of the difficulty politically in saying no. And some people, particularly in my opinion, industry, saw it as a way to either get rid of or fundamentally change NICE. And the evidence for this is in an extraordinary document in the Prescription Pricing Regulation Scheme 209, which is a chapter and an annex, which is totally from the pharmaceutical industry, and says they're holding focus groups and they're going to change the cost-benefit perspective, and they will bring in value-based pricing. as a result of this, it was very unclear when the government consulted. Were they consulting about abolishing NICE, or were they consulting about something fairly technical about changing the perspective in a cost-benefit analysis? And many people, including myself, thought they were likely to abolish NICE. And the notion of value-based pricing is a US import. It's linked to work from Michael Porter, and it's described as health outcome per dollar. Value-based pricing is something pretty close to cost per quality, in my opinion, or many of the people at the time wondered what is going to be different. Is it a way of getting rid of cost per quality, or is it a way of refining cost per quality? And it had been, I couldn't resist this quote. I think my favorite one from the US health economist is Uwe Reinhardt. He says, why anybody would want to learn from the US is completely beyond him. They spend more than any other country in the world and have the worst outcomes. Discuss. So there was a lot of concern that the minister was saying one thing and meant something utterly different when he talked about value-based pricing. And in terms of getting rid of NICE, the proposal, and this was on the consultation, was to set up expert panels that would make the decisions instead of NICE, which to any sane reader implied the end of NICE having power. And the news media predicted the death of NICE, which seemed fairly reasonable. As I said, the consultation was extraordinary because there was this impact assessment from the Department of Health. And it argued that any premium for innovation simply couldn't work, because giving a premium in one market, the UK market, which is 3% of global market, isn't going to have any effect. And it found no evidence for the, public support for higher values, for amending the quality or weighting the quality, for severity, for end of life, or for innovation. Now the problem was NICE had already been told to introduce an end of life allowance, so the job was to try and find a justification for a policy that had already been introduced, and a way also of dealing with the Cancer Drugs Fund, which had already been introduced. So there was a series of impossible tasks being set. And it is important to put this in a wider context, because the coalition government wasn't just focused on value-based pricing. That was a small part of an attempt to make major changes in the National Health Service. And those major changes were to do with ensuring that the market reforms that had been introduced in the 1990s, where the purchasers and the providers were separated, that those would be implemented in law and would be difficult to change. And the discussion of the methods was presented in conventional microeconomics, which sees the market as the best solution. And the phrase that was used, I've said, is economies, wider social benefits, or in the way that Gavin has just produced, net production effects. Many people didn't understand, in my opinion, and worried that this was part of bringing more market into the NHS, and as a result distrusted it. And as I've said, the topic was eventually passed to NICE, who did a second consultation and put it on the shelf and said nothing will happen. So what was really going on? Well, my opinion was that industry wanted to hobble or abolish NICE. They believed that value-based pricing would raise the threshold, that there would be no losers. And what became clear was that if any of the changes that were being introduced were introduced, there would be losers. And I think what Gavin has just talked about is really quite important, in the sense that the losers would be cancer drugs. Extraordinarily, the ones who would lose would be the cancer drugs, who we've already set up a fund to fund them separately. and some of the most interesting and amusing reactions were for some of the companies who sell cancer drugs, realizing that instead of making the cost per quality threshold more generous, it would make it much tighter, because the cancer drugs, to the effect that they work at all, they keep people alive in very poor quality of life, and they consume more. And that was a major realization for industry that this could be very bad news for some of the big players. So there was a clash between evidence-based policy and politics. And I think that's one of the really interesting themes that comes out, that the push towards evidence-based policy with the Department of Health, with particularly the necessity to do consultations and impact assessments, meant that there's reviews of the evidence, and if there isn't evidence, then they will try to commission evidence and find out what it is that the population believes, which is right. I think that's tremendous. And as I say, value-based pricing was only one of a number of issues, and the proof of the pudding, the proof of my argument, is that other parts of NICE had already changed the economic perspective. And what had happened is that the public health program in NICE, which isn't to do with drugs, it's to do with things like exercise and obesity and so on, it had long been concerned with applying cost-benefit analysis, and particularly the valuation of future benefits, but also it didn't like the narrow NHS perspective. It was in favour of taking a societal perspective, a wider perspective, because public health had moved into the local authorities. It was no longer in the National Health Service, it was part of the local authorities. But also, many of the arguments about the cost effectiveness of public health interventions depend on the wider social impact. They depend on people not being ill, being able to work for longer, being able to care for longer, all in the ways that you've just seen in some of Gavin's slides. So a part of NICE had already moved to a societal perspective and to changes in the discount rate. And they presented it as a return on investment, a societal perspective, and it happened without any comment. Talking to somebody earlier, it happened by the back door, it happened as a technical issue, but there was no fuss. It was not controversial. So we have the same organization with two programs, one having a fierce row and commissioning lots of studies, and the other just changing it and saying, well, do this if it's appropriate. What is the right perspective? Well, there is an interesting paper, useful paper, commissioned on the appropriate perspectives for healthcare decisions, and by York again. They reviewed the literature and the theory, and they found a lack of clarity as to what constitutes this, and fundamentally that there was no consideration of the implications of fixed budgets. And they addressed, and the central issue here is, if the NHS has a fixed budget, which it certainly does in the short term, then having a cost per quality, as NICE has, that is higher than the going rate of a cost per quality in the NHS, NICE could be making things worse. It all depends on what is the going rate in the NHS, and that's some of the stuff that's just been presented. But they argued that extra welfareism could be justified if you had a budget-specific cost perspective, but that a wider perspective was needed if the consequences fell outside that budget. And that's exactly what happened with public health program, that many of the consequences fell outside the health budget, and that there was a key role for the opportunity costs within a fixed budget. The other big issue on this is that if the health budget is used to generate savings outside health, will the health budget get money back from those other departments? And the argument generally is it's very unlikely in the current context where the health budget is protected in the UK and the other government department budgets are not protected. I'm describing a blunder. This is a small blunder by comparison. This is a wonderful account published in 2013 by two major political scientists, and it's called The Blunders of Our Governments, and it reviews 13 horror stories of major blunders up to 210. The poll tax, pensions, child support agency, the Dome, remember the Dome, it's still there, it's now a concert venue, training tax credits, the Tube, new Tube, ID cards, NHS IT, NHS information systems. We wasted 12 billion on those, and they include in a later chapter the NHS reforms as a possible likely major blunder, and the reasons for these failures: highly centralised government, able to make decisions very quickly, very short term, particularly ministers only being there for a short time. asymmetries of expertise. What that means is that the contracting out was very common, and it often contracted out the experts from the government departments to work on the side of industry, and but extraordinarily as well, in many of these projects there wasn't a designated project manager, and some of these projects were gigantic, and a deficit of deliberation. So value-based pricing was a very small item in this, but I think there are lessons to be learned about the repeated blunders that governments have made. So what might we learn from all of this? Well, first, I think it's very difficult if there's distrust at the start. And there was a lot of distrust caused by the minister's statements that made it appear he was going to abolish NICE and so on. So there was a lot of distrust as to what was going on. Secondly, it was only one policy among many, and the other policies were very pro-market. There was lack of clarity about what was going on, which led to exaggerated fears. The initial view or hope that it would raise the cost per quality threshold proved wrong. There would be losers as well as gainers. And I've talked about this, that the cost per quality threshold could go up or down, and that this was true of many of the cancer drugs. The answer, the UK has led the way in how not to do it. Be careful before you go there, any of the rest of you. And I've tried to outline it all in the blogs, and I'm happy to pick up on any discussion or any questions that people have. Thank you.
So I hope you'll all agree. Three very different talks, lots to discuss, I hope. So we have about 20 minutes at least, no, more than that, half an hour for discussion. So I'm going to open up the floor and ask you to put your questions, and please just say who you are, where you're from, and yeah, hands up please.
I'm Juan Carlos Rejón from the Office of Health Economics, and I want to ask something to Gavin, two different questions. One, within your framework, would it be possible to include less tangible things than the ones that you are including as productivity and so on, if there is evidence of willingness to pay from the public? That's one question. And the other one, are there, have you thought about decision rules within your framework? As I'm thinking of the table that you were showing, because one could think, okay, if everything, so if investing in dementia, for example, gives you so much return, we could invest everything in dementia, like just theoretically, but I guess you would want to meet all diseases and so on, and have you thought about that kind of decision rules, and if, for example, things like unmet need would get more priority, even if it's something that gives you a negative return?
Okay, to address the second point first, if I've understood it correctly, well, this methodology simply estimates the value of economic consequences of changes in health. Does nothing else at all. Nothing to do with unmet need. I mean, you could characterise unmet need in terms of, well, quality losses and this stuff if you wanted to, but it does not go beyond the economic consequences at all. You can use it in any decision rule you want to. It's completely agnostic in that sense, which I think is partly what you're asking. So you asked as well if you could include less tangible effects if there was evidence of willingness to pay. Well, so the definition there is the scope of this economic consequences through production and consumption. If any are missing, then that's a gap in this methodology, and anyone can do anything they like with it, but if they wanted to complete that gap, they would add it in. Sorry, I can't. Without a particular example, it's difficult for me to say anything more specific. Do you have a specific thing you were thinking of?
Yeah, I was thinking the value of information, for instance, that diagnostics generate beyond the impact on clinical decisions, for instance. So a diagnostic test that might give patients information they value, that there is some evidence of willingness to pay from the side of patients to get that information, but that doesn't necessarily need to have an impact on their on the clinical decisions that physicians make on the health outcomes that happens after the results of those tests are out there.
Okay. Okay, yes, well that makes it easy to answer. So what I described is, well, in principle, we divide consequences up into the impact on the patient and the impact on others. This methodology describes the latter. What you describe is part of an impact on the patient. So if you believe that QALYs don't capture it, then it ought to be added in your estimate of the benefits to the patient. So, I mean, from that perspective, it would be separate to this.
A very quick comment on your... Oh.
Very quick comment on your note, your point about dementia. Should we spend a lot more on dementia? Only if we have something that works. The drugs for dementia don't work.
Good morning, I'm Pilar Pinilla, I'm from NICE. First of all, thank you very much for your presentations, very informative. My question is not directed to any of you, so you can decide who wants to respond it. My question is about, you mentioned the duplicities, if I'm correct, and if I understood it correctly, that there may be some duplicities between the Cancer Drugs Fund and what we do at NICE. So my question will be about how will you recommend or suggest to improve efficiencies within the system to make this work? Thank you.
Well, I'm sure there's...
I'm happy to go first. I mean, it seems to me we need to get to a situation where we don't have a separate pot. So if politicians or analysis suggests there are reasons why you might want to have a higher threshold for cancer drugs, then you ask NICE to administer that. What James and I, and James, we're happy to pick this up there. I showed you the paper that Martin Buxton led that we were both authors of, and Mark Sculfer was as well. We were proposing, at least as an interim, if there is a fund, then it should be used to do coverage with evidence development, or we have this new phrase in the UK, commissioning through evaluation. So basically those drugs where they might come within NICE's threshold, but the evidence, there's a lot of uncertainty that the money would start using those drugs whilst we collected additional evidence, and then they would be re-reviewed by NICE. So we thought that might be a better way of using the Cancer Drugs Fund money. But I think my critical point is, which James brought out very clearly, there's not a lot of point in having a rationing body if you then have another route and another pot which has a completely different set of rationing principles. So what we need to do somehow is work out what the politicians think is appropriate in terms of the public preferences for cancer drugs, and then tell NICE to do that and have one process.
Joan Rovira, University of Barcelona. It's a question common to Gavin. I feel that if I understood, you don't plan to value leisure time gained. Is it so? Or I didn't misunderstand?
Well, so again, I think to think about that, we have to start by going back to this definition that we've taken of separating out impact on patients and impact on everybody else, to the extent that a patient would gain leisure time, that's part of how you value the patient benefits and not what we're valuing here. To the extent that there are impacts on other people, which we are attempting to value here, I think in principle they are included, in particular through the measurement of informal care consumption. So, for instance, if a treatment reduces the amount of informal care required by someone's family, we in fact estimate that as a number of hours, which we then value. If you take the marginal value of time that we use to be illustrative of the value of leisure, which I think is a decent initial assumption, then we are in fact valuing the impact on the leisure time of the family of patients.
Okay, but then you don't consider it explicitly. In that sense, I think that this is a kind of, incoherence with the general values of a public system, because, with your formula saying, well, we will count production less consumption. No? So for a person who is already retired, then probably you will have only consumption. So the additional years for that person is nothing. Whereas for someone who is really working, you will count something. From the point of view of society, I don't think that should be the difference, because society is paying someone already if they spend gained years by to work. So I see a kind of incoherence.
Yeah, I think I'm a great fan of Gavin's work. I don't support the view that it's built around a threshold of 13,000, but it does seem to be that so I wouldn't agree with the anchor point. But I think the key point for me is that you're talking about unpaid work as well as paid work. And what the analysis does that for me is so fascinating, and you saw it in some of Gavin's figures, is that people who are retired do huge amounts of unpaid work. Now, they are the primary source of informal care, for not just typically for their partners, but typically for grandchildren, a whole variety of things. So this notion that when you retire, you stop doing anything productive is just nonsense, and we know it anyway. But what Gavin's exercise showed is you can actually value that. And I think the interesting thing is that chart that Gavin put up a couple of times, which shows you that far more important than age in terms of your social impact is your state of health. Now, obviously, there's a link between age and your state of health, but at any point in time, the key driver is not your age; it's your state of health, right? And because of the amount that healthy elderly people spend in unpaid productive labour, and I think that for me is a key in understanding the results that Gavin was working with.
Gavin, are you able to say anything? I don't know if you know off the top of your head what the kind of distinction is for those contributions, the productivity contributions of people after retirement. Do you have a feel for how that breaks down according to childcare or other activities? What kind of things? I mean, there'd be big implications for Spain, I imagine, having seen the number of grandparents walking around with children around all the play parks of Spain that I've seen.
Yeah, I don't have it on the top of my head, but I have it on my laptop. We have this defined to an incredible level of detail. I mean, almost certainly too much detail that at the lowest level you couldn't believe it. But unpaid labour, for instance, we estimate it by using a survey in which respondents record what they do for 10 minutes, every 10-minute period of a day, and they record it across 3,000 types of activity. And what we've done is we've categorised those according to those we think represent unpaid labour and those which we think aren't. But we can go down to the categories, and as I say, when you get to very low levels, you get lots of you get small samples. But in principle, yes, you could ask how much of any of those types of activity is being provided. And I can imagine that obviously this survey is done in the UK. If there were a corresponding one in Spain, you might get very different answers, and it could be interesting.
You had a question,
John Cairns, London School of Hygiene, Tropical Medicine. probably should declare an interest. I'm in my 12th year in a NICE appraisal committee, so I obviously believe we'd be doing something of some value. My question is a general one to any of the three, and that is, what's their view about the changes that are happening at a European level and in UK government to encourage the NHS to do, as it were, more than simply make people better, but to perhaps work with industry more closely to encourage economic development? And then maybe the tip of the iceberg is these appraisal procedures, how we'd make decisions on new drugs, and fine-tuning these procedures in order to, or changing them completely, in order to change the environment in which important industries like pharmaceutical industry are working. What's your view about that direction of travel?
I'm happy to go first. I mean, it seems to me you get into a much debated topic amongst economists around the world. So, should the health system, if there are, let's take it for granted, although it may be disputed, that there are economic benefits from having a high R&D activity located in your country. Then the question is, do you try and get those benefits through your health system, or do you say if they're there, this is a completely different department, this is industry policy? And in Australia, they've debated this and have different approaches. My view is you can't do it that way. In effect, if you're the customer and the health system is the customer, and you think there are enormous additional economic benefits from the way in which you buy or you organise your clinical research activity, then you have to do it as one system. Separate question as to when you go to the Treasury and ask for more money, whether you should be able to demonstrate those benefits and get more funding as a consequence of that. But it does seem to me that there's an issue here that economists have much debated, and there's been lots of debate in the UK as well. How you then systematise that is another challenge, I think.
Can I say a couple of things? I think I'm on the side of keeping industry and health policy separate, or at least being very clear when and by how much is the health budget subsidising industry. And it's a very tricky one, because industrial policy in a multinational world is a very tricky one. About UK, is GSK a UK company or a multinational, and how much does the NHS matter to some of these companies, given that UK is such a small share of the market? The other big worry I have, though, is that this can't be discussed without looking at what's happening to the prices of new drugs. The prices of new drugs are going through the roof. The average spend per head in the NHS is £2,000 per person per year, and drugs are coming in that are costing £100,000 per person per year. And the reason they're doing that is because they're being priced for the US market, which has completely unique circumstances where the public sector has to buy cancer drugs, whatever the price at. And the technologies have changed to enable discovery of genetically specific subgroups for whom the drugs work. So prices are being set for a US market which is utterly dysfunctional and which are being imposed on the rest of the world. And that's the big story. And until that's sorted out, it's going to be very difficult to work with industry.
Yeah, my name is Javier de Renteria from Canton Health, Germany. Now we've seen that value-based pricing won't implement, and you have in the UK a new government. What's going to happen next with NICE evaluation? Is it going to stick at the traditional evaluation, or do you think that value is going to be included?
I'll give it a try. I think NICE will continue pretty much as is, but it's very important to take into account that NICE very seldom says no, because of the Cancer Drugs Fund, because of different other funds. Orphan drugs are essentially exempted, multiple sclerosis drugs are exempted, so the refusal rate is very small. The really important development, which I think Adrian picked up on, is the patient access schemes, which allows price negotiation. And I think that has expanded in the last 4 or 5 years and will continue. And the problem for the rest of the world is that the price discounts are confidential. But actually, they're quite easy to work out if you look at the detail. I've done that and happy to share that as well. And they're not very high in most cases.
I mean, I'll just say, I think what I was trying to pull together at the end of my presentation was, I mean, NICE is looking at value, but it's looking at primarily measures of health gain, health system cost, and then trying to take into account some other factors. So the element of value-based assessment, which was to try and systematize and quantify some key elements of those, particularly severity and broader societal effects, are not there. I think they will come back. I don't think the debate is going to go away. We have a big issue around societal effects, because I think at the moment NICE is formally not allowed to consider those. But the whole emphasis in the UK, as in other health systems, is around integrated care. So the impact on formal and informal care of an intervention is going to become particularly important. So somehow we have to think about how we take that into account. That was one key element of Gavin's analysis. So I don't think it's going to go away. I think it'll keep coming back in other forms, to be honest, because points about oncology, and we come back to, in a sense, the political story of why this didn't work. But it seems to me we had lots of good pieces of analysis, both from Shah and York and from Gavin's group. We can revisit the politics, but I think we have to recognise, and I completely take James's points about the dysfunctionality of the US oncology market, which is a key issue why, in a sense, we have all these oncology drugs, and they land on Europe, and we all have to decide what to do about them. But so there is this oncology issue, but in principle, we ought to be sending signals to the industry and the rest, and indeed the rest of the health system, that things that delay people going into care, or things that get people back to work, these are actually worth more than just the health effect, and we ought to be signalling that, and somehow that we need to be building that into our evaluation and assessment processes.
I mean, one thing I can say is that the one element of what was value-based pricing originally, the consideration of additional weights according to the burden of illness, is already back on NICE's agenda, and the unit that I run is revisiting some of that evidence, and NICE will consider that in due course. But the point that was just being made about the distinction between the sort of technical work, particularly that EPRU at Sheffield and York did around these different weights, versus the political problem. It seems to me the political problem here is around the cancer drugs, and every definition of burden of illness, other than end of life, doesn't solve that. In fact, most definitions would make it worse, I think. So that I'm not sure if you want to comment on that. It just seems a bit of a conundrum.
I mean, all I would add very quickly, I think I would add orphan drugs as well. It seems to me there are two challenges: oncology drugs and orphan drugs. And if you try to build your solution into the general system, what you'll end up doing is screwing up not being able to reform your general system. So I do think, as much as possible, the approaches to those need to be consistent with how you're treating everything else. But if you try and get it all in one system, then there's a high risk of total failure. So I do, to some extent, I think we have to recognise that we probably need sort of band-aids for orphan drugs and oncology going in the immediate short term until we get a handle on how what we think is society's underlying preferences and willingness to pay here. And if we try and get it all in one system, then it's going to stop us reforming and moving forward on all the other areas that are also extremely important. That will be my take on it.
Yes. Good morning. My name is Belén Corbacho, and I work at the University of York. And I really enjoyed your talk this morning here today. And I was thinking, in my opinion, I think this that has been happening in the UK in the last 2-3 years, rather than mining NICE appraisal methods, has reinforced the methods, in my opinion, just trying to take huge range of different values in the way NICE is making decisions at the moment. But as Professor Rafter said, a lot of work has been commissioned, a lot of work has been done, and especially, for example, regarding cost opportunity and the threshold. I'd like to see or to know your opinion. What do you think if this work is going to be taken into account? And for example, the Department of Health and NICE and the NHS will be sitting there together and, for example, revalue or reassess the threshold and see how it could work better in order to make NHS more efficient.
I mean, just quickly on the threshold. I mean, it seems to me we have a window. We have a window because basically, it's the issue with the threshold is primarily focused on drugs. The PPRS says the threshold will not change till 2018, till 2019. So in principle, we have a window of 2 or 3 years where we can actually do some, try and do some further analysis plus some dialogue. But it does seem to me the core of all this is what we're all debating and getting very angry with each other about, those of us who spend time on the threshold debate, is we're trying to understand what's happening in the rest of the NHS and the rest of the health system. But the fundamental problem is we don't know what happens when NICE decides to say yes to a drug. And understanding decision-making in the rest of the health system will, first of all, hopefully help us work out how to improve decision-making in the rest of the health system. And as a byproduct, it will make us better informed about the potential opportunity cost of a NICE decision. So I think we've got 2 or 3 year period to actually invest time in doing that.
At the risk of everyone getting angry, I mean, I think that if the cost per quality estimate at the margin by York is thought to be correct methodologically, which is a completely different question. We do know, well, that it is an estimate of what happens on average when NICE reallocates £1 million. Whether it's the correct number or not is a methodological issue, but I think the promise of that work is that the question you posed does have an answer, and that we don't need to know that every other treatment or activity in the NHS is assessed for cost per quality. This is the whole point of that approach, is that you observe the outcomes however they were arrived at, and the change in health for a change in cost, however that is translated through. So I just want to pick you up on that first bit.
Can I just come back on that very briefly, because I think, and you know, I completely agree. It does seem, in the sense that it does seem to me, if we don't know what's happening at the health system level, then the obvious thing to do, looking at the centre, is to take a revealed preference approach. What have they actually done? When we gave them more money, what did they do, and what did we get out of it? And that's you know, in a sense, the York approach is saying, well, that's the best starting point for understanding what we think at the centre is likely to happen if NICE takes £1 million away from them and spends it on something else, or they've got £1 million less because it's being spent. The problem is that if the assumptions you have to make in order to get that revealed preference are so complex and large in number, then you may also want to go back and look at another approach, which is try and understand what these people are actually doing. And when you find out these people are not using cost per quality at all, it does make you slightly uncomfortable. So I think, you know, revealed preference, I completely understand. It does seem to me the obvious way to go. But if you have to make huge numbers of assumptions that you're not clear of the validity of, at least I'm not clear of the validity of, then I do think you get into looking at other methodological approaches as well, and they start to give you very different feel for what's going on. So I think that's our challenge, I think.
My worry about the threshold is that when there's pressure on the health service, services are curtailed, and they're often elective surgery, and we know that they're highly cost effective, that most of elective surgery has very good cost per quality. So rather than being too worried about the rest of the NHS, all of it, I see a case for protecting services that we know have a proven low cost per quality and protecting them when there's cutbacks, and building in incentives for other services to demonstrate what their cost effectiveness is, because that is missing at the moment. So I agree entirely, we do need to know what's going on, but while we're trying to find out what's going on in the rest of the service, we need to protect the bits that we know are cost effective.
Yeah, another question. I don't know if you have the answer, but from being abroad, we always read that the life expectancy of oncology patients in the UK is lower than the life expectancy in Spain or in Germany. Do you think that has related to this curtailing of services, because it's not only drugs? No? What would be kind of the assumptions or explanation for that?
It's a good question, and I don't think there's agreement about what the answer is among the experts. There are obviously differences in the genetic background of populations and so on. The most interesting work in the UK, and you're right, the UK survival rate, 5-year survival rate for a whole range of cancers is poorer than in many other European countries. And quite a lot of work has been done on that. Some people have gone straight to the conclusion that we should fund more cancer drugs, which is not the answer, I think. The most interesting work, and for me the most convincing work, is that the UK, the NHS is poor at picking up cancers early. And some of that is that people don't report to even to a GP, to a general doctor, and the general practitioners are often not good at referring people on sufficiently quickly. And that's where a lot of the changes have begun to happen. But I think there's still quite a long way to go on that.
Yeah, I would just add, Mike Richards, who was then the cancer czar for the Department of Health and now has become Chief Inspector of Hospitals for the NHS. He did an OHE lecture for us a few years ago that's on our website, and he made the key point, that, echoed by James, that first of all, cancer treatment is mostly surgery. Drugs are not, and there's an important issue, I think, going forwards as to whether we think the mix is going to change. So if we were talking to oncologists saying where are the gains in health from treating cancers over the next, say, 50 years, are those going to be from improving our surgical approaches? Are they going to come from drugs, a combination, whatever? But at the moment, it's mostly surgery. And as James said, all the evidence seems to suggest that our big problem is lack of early diagnosis. Of course, you can improve your survival rates through earlier diagnosis without actually having an impact on the disease if you've just diagnosed them earlier. So we have to be a little bit careful in going for early diagnosis. But in principle, a lot of cancers are treatable initially by surgery, but also by drugs. And so the big emphasis from Mike Richards, which we've started to see, has been to get more incentives and capability within primary care for earlier diagnosis and earlier referrals, so we can get patients into the system and get them treated appropriately. That's, I think, is probably the most important thing that the UK can do.
My name is Javier Mar from the Hospital Alto Deva in the Basque Country. My question was a bit different, just to make to learn some lesson for Spain. I think that in Spain, a key difference is the lack of involvement of this kind of issues in the academic in the academia. Clearly, the debate about economic evaluation this is my personal view, but is seen in the university as something not like research, but more like consultancy. And I think that one of the consequences is that, in general, professional and academia, we are clearly not involved at the same level that in the UK. And my question is, at which level is acknowledged all this work in the academia, like really important research for the
country. However, sometimes it is not well recognized in the high impact journals, because the university is also involved in changing the society. And this is recognized at the university level as a big objective.
I think it's a really interesting and important question, and I think the reason that it is different in the UK is fundamentally that the National Health Service has devoted 1% of its spending to research over the last 25 years. And that has meant that health economists in particular have been employed, but also clinicians running trials, that a whole infrastructure has developed. And the entry to the academy and to having universities recognize that has been difficult and has been subject to repeated rows to get recognition. But fundamentally, having external funding from the health service for research has changed the way health research is recognized in the universities and in terms of how people are promoted, hired, and so on. Most of my career has been funded by the National Health Service. And I think that's true of NICE, it's true of the groups that do the work for NICE, and it's true of the attempts to do clinical trials right across the range of health technologies that are introduced. So I think that is a fundamental lesson, and it has taken 25 years to do.
I'll just very quickly add, and I think Sir Michael Peckham, who was the first NHS R&D director, was a key driver in this, and one of his early, very transformative from an economics point of view, health economics point of view, was him saying, if you apply for money for a clinical trial and you don't have any economists in it, you won't get funded. So that transformed the attitude of the clinical and medical schools towards employing health economists. Absolutely transformative, and as James said, along with other things, and the money has been, I think, key within the UK.
Okay, so we are out of time. If there are more questions, I'm sure you'll be able to catch our speakers in the break. Thanks very much for coming. I hope you've enjoyed the session, and I'd just like to say thanks to all three of the speakers. Excellent talks, and thank you for answering the questions as well. Thank you very much.